Okay, I'm going to let everyone in. We are now live. When we get to slideshow, I will make you host again, just in case it stops my live thing. I don't think it will, but I don't know that. So that's why I thought I'd make you host later on. Okay, let's go. Okay, we're now live on YouTube. Hello, everyone.
Hello. Hi.
Good evening. How are we all?
We're fine, thank you. Hi.
Good, good. Whereabouts have we got? So I'm near Manchester. Whereabouts are you from?
Leeds.
There's a lot of Leeds people. I can tell
We've got a lot of Northerners.
Yes, we're all here.
Well, you had to come out in force to support Graeme, so I'm glad you're all, the Leeds lot is here.
For sure. Oh,
We're just going to make sure that no one else is coming in, but we'll let them in just as they come. Thank you for choosing your Friday evening with us to celebrate the launch of Graeme's first short story collection. It's called The Goddess of Macau. It's a gorgeous collection. And I always say that it sort of encompasses Macau myths, Macau medicine, and a bit of magic thrown in there. So we're going to hear all about that tonight. We're going to read two stories. Well, Graeme is. Graeme's probably going to be very tired at the end of the evening. So he's going to read one for us. Then we're going to have a slideshow based on Graeme's experiences in Macau. And then we are going to go to a second story. And then we're going to have a Q&A. So, oh, Benjamin, you are not in black and white anymore. So Ben at the top is doing our Q&A. He was looking a bit vintage earlier in black and white, but we've got colour now, just for you guys. He's going to lead it. He's got loads of questions, but if you have questions to Graeme as well, and you are more than welcome to, then either you can raise your hand and ask in person, or you can put your name in the chat and then we'll come to you, or you can just write the whole question in the chat. It's completely up to you. I don't know if we had a question now or not. So some people are just connecting to audio. But yes, so there's one person coming in. We're almost all here. When Graeme starts reading the first story, just probably put yourself on mute just in case we have some background noise. But apart from that, we're more than happy for you to be chatty. Yeah, and if there's any background noise, we can just mute you. Nothing personal, but we can just mute you, so don't worry about it. Okay, so I think everyone can hear us. So I think, do you want to introduce your first story, Graeme, or do you want to say a little bit about how you put together the stories just before?
Yes, happy to, Isabel, though we may touch on some of this when Ben asks me questions later. I should say a big thank you, though, to everybody who is here from the Leeds Writers Circle, because the vast majority of these stories have been read in some form or another of the Writers Circle. They've been workshopped by a short story group of the Writers Circle. And most people there have heard these stories through various forms and iterations. And generally, the Writers Circle in Leeds have been wonderfully supportive of me, and this would not have been possible without them. So that's a big thank you to them, and thank you for coming tonight as well to hear that. This particular story I'm going to read, An Apartment on Coloane, I think was possibly the most recent story set in Macau that I've written. And the reviewer in the Asian Review of Books did correctly pick up that there is a link in, which we might talk about later, to the goddess Matsu. But it also just came from the general thought I had myself. What would it be like if you really genuinely could tell the future? And I just slightly took it from there. But I do recall that when we were working this, doing this story as an early draft of this story went to the short story group of the Writers Circle. I think I was the only person in that meeting who actually didn't believe a word of the ability to tell the future. Almost everybody else did, but which just goes to show that you can write about anything if you have enough conviction, even if you don't necessarily believe it. Anyway, let's start with the story. It's called An Apartment on Coloane. The thing is, I'm actually the real deal, not one of those fakes or tricksters who prey on people. the con artists who take advantage of them and make a few dollars out of their problems, keeping everybody happy by telling them what they want to hear. For the tourists, it's just one of those things they do when they come to Macau, along with eating, shopping, and gambling. It's an act, a show, a game both sides play and everybody knows the rules. Me, no, I'm the real thing. I truly can see into the future. And believe me, I wish I couldn't. It's rarely anything to look forward to. I have a client booked in for this morning. In the past, I worked the temples and the night markets like street performers. I did Cao Chim, reading the sticks and interpreting the oracle. I was a master of face reading, palm reading, all the stuff I had to do to make a living. I went through the motions of what the punters expected of me, even though I could have answered their questions without any of that fakery. These days, I'm an old man, and I just do it my way. I don't care much for going out, so I prefer to stay indoors. But luckily, my reputation is such that I don't have to spend all day at the temple, and instead they come to my apartment. Today, it's a young woman, a Miss Choi, no more than 20, whose mother is ill. I can tell she's doubtful, wondering what she's doing in this somewhat tatty living room. She's attractive and smartly dressed in a modern style, jeans, a Versace t-shirt, or at least a Versace knockoff, and a gold necklace. Her looks only serve to emphasize the drab emptiness of the room. For the past few months, I've been slowly getting rid of things, divesting myself of a life, and there isn't much furniture left, just the little I still need. But I ask her to take a seat on the worn black leather sofa that continues to take up one side of the room. A framed photograph of my parents hangs on the wall. I always like to let the client start, so I pull over a chair and wait for her to speak. When she does, her voice is quiet and hesitant, and I can only just hear her over the sound of the ceiling fan gently stirring the air above us. I'm not sure why I'm here, she starts. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but I don't believe in all this mumbo jumbo. I don't take offense. The young ones are always like that. They pretend not to believe, and yet still they come. The older generation believe implicitly without any apologies. There is no mumbo jumbo, Miss Choi. I have certain skills, that is all. And that's the truth of it. I've always had this ability, ever since I was a boy. I was 7 when out of the blue I announced to my parents, Big Uncle's going to die. Big Uncle was my grandmother's brother. He lived alone on Koloan down a dirt track, completely out of the way with no neighbors anywhere close. And to my younger self, he seemed ancient, though in reality, he must have been about the same age I am now. We had just left his home. My parents had wanted to ask him something when the words came out. I must have shocked them. I surprised myself. My father told me to be quiet and stop being so disrespectful of the elderly. But later my mother was friendly and took me to one side and tried to explain how one day we would all die. No, I said, I mean, he's going to die tomorrow. My mother drew back and slapped me hard across the face, sending me to bed with no supper. The next day, Big Uncle died, a massive stroke that came out of the blue while he was playing mahjong in the tea shop. They're always looking for hope. That's the worst of it. But because I know the truth, hope is the last thing I can give them. Miss Choi wants to know that her mother will recover, that all will be well. But it won't, and there's nothing I can do to change that. I can already see that her mother will die shortly. All I can do is to try and tell her gently. It will be a relief in some ways when all this is over. When it comes down to it, people always ask about the same 3 things: health, business, and love. I suppose these are the subjects that matter to us most. Will my mother get better? Should I invest in this stock? Will he make a good husband? I used to wonder why I only had bad news to give. But in time, I came to understand that people only go to a fortune teller when they have doubts, and their doubts were usually well-founded. You don't waste your money when you know you're in love with someone. Just now and then I was surprised and able to give good news, but that wasn't often. More often, like today, an illness was incurable, a business investment unwise, and a lover unfaithful. The grief everyone felt over Big Uncle's death overshadowed my prediction, which was somehow forgotten. Over the years, I've tried and failed to understand how it works, but when I was very young, my skills were limited, crude. I could only see the most dramatic, close events. As I got older, I was able to refine my abilities, to see things that were subtler and further away. To begin, it seemed a blessing. Friends and family sought my opinion on everything, and I was always popular at the dog track. But in time, it became relentless. It wasn't enough that I could see answers to specific questions. No, images of the future started to come on me unasked. I could be walking down the street and the destiny of strangers passing by crowded in on me. I was being overwhelmed by the future, deafened by the fates of everybody around me. Relationships became impossible. How could I love someone when I knew exactly what they were going to do or what was going to happen to them? When I was 20, I went out with this girl for a while, but soon I knew she was seeing someone else. She denied it, and when I told her they were going to spend a weekend together in Hong Kong, she said that was nonsense. 2 days later, she discovered that her new boyfriend had bought the ferry tickets. Girlfriends became suspicious of me, of my motives, of everything I said and did. They wondered what I knew, and sometimes predictions became self-fulfilling. The worst of it was when my parents died. My father went first, 20 years ago, and then my mother. Of course I knew, and they must have known that I knew, but it's the only time I've ever lied about the future. With my father, I had a general sense some months in advance, which became stronger and more definite as the weeks progressed. When he fell ill, my mother asked me, "Will he recover? You must know, so tell me, please." I fudged my answer. I didn't want to lie, but I couldn't tell the truth either. I said that I couldn't see clearly. I said that perhaps I was too close, that with family my vision was clouded. I doubt if my mother believed me, and a year later, when she started having heart trouble, she asked me to be honest with her. She said she wanted to know so that she could put things in order if she had to. Telling my mother she had only 3 months to live was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. That's when I retreated to my apartment here in Koloan, staying indoors, away from people as much as I could. I'd become something of a monk or a hermit, and I think I now understand why Big Uncle lived here. It's as close as you can get in Macau to the middle of nowhere. I still need money to live on though, so I started taking private appointments. Miss Choi tells me about her mother. The stomach pain started 2 years ago, I think. They may have started before that, but my mother never said anything. I think she kept quiet about it, didn't want to worry my father. Tell me about them, your parents. I don't need to know, but she needs to tell me. Sometimes I'm part therapist. They have a small restaurant on Taipa. It doesn't really make any money, but it's my mother's love. My father, he's not very practical. I don't know how he'll cope if anything happens to her. I have to decide whether to tell her that her father will die a few months after her mother. I often have this dilemma. They come to ask me about the future, but how much do they really want to know? Do they want the whole truth? I can't be dishonest. I will never lie to them, but I can decide how much to tell them. This time I elect against telling her unless she asks specifically. It's her mother she's come about, not her father. My mother? I'm sorry, Miss Choi. I don't need to say anything else. I think about taking her hand, but she draws herself inwards and I leave her to her thoughts for a time. Miss Choi spends an hour with me in the end. I don't need all that time to tell her what she needs to know, but she needs the time to take it in. She's my final client and I'm in no rush. And anyway, there's something about her that I respond to. We seem chalk and cheese, oil and water, but I'm drawn to her. Not in a sexual way, not at my age, and certainly not now, but I sense a connection. That's unusual. For all that I can see everything about a person's life, it is always very abstract. I feel no more about them than I do the weather. But with Miss Choi, it's different. I'm sorry for her, of course, but more than that, there's something about her I can't see clearly, and that intrigues me. Normally I can read people completely, but not with Miss Choi. There's a curtain I can't see beyond. I know what will happen to her parents, but nothing about herself. She blows her nose as she starts to gather her things. There have been a few tears, but I don't want to let her go. That's another thing that is unusual. Normally, I'm anxious to be alone again. Would you like some tea before you go? I ask. She looks at me. She seems troubled by something beyond her mother and accepts the offer. I go to the kitchen, and when I return with a teapot and 2 cups, she is the one who takes my hand. Are you okay? She asks. Can I help? Is there anything I can do for you? I'm surprised by her questions. It's as if our roles have been reversed. Only slowly do I begin to understand. You know? I ask. I'm sorry, she says. There's no need to be. I've known for a long time now. I'm prepared for it. It will be a blessing in some ways. But I wasn't prepared for this, for you knowing. You can see, can't you? Yes. She says this calmly, very matter of fact and without much emotion. Perhaps that's a good sign for her future. She'll need to keep a sense of detachment. When Big Uncle died, I was too young for it to register, but there were family stories about how he had second sight. When I was a young man, I came to understand that somehow his skills came to me when he died, an inheritance of sorts, a transition between generations, and now they are passing to Miss Choi. I will be dead tomorrow. I've known for several months that my life was coming to an end, and more recently I've been able to foresee the time and date. Tomorrow afternoon, a little after lunch. When Big Uncle died, he didn't know that I was going to take up the burden, but I have a little time left still. Perhaps in the remaining hours I can explain things to Miss Choi, tell her how it will be, offer words of advice. There was nobody to help me, and there's so much that I need to tell her. Perhaps one day she'll also end up living in a small apartment on Koloan. Miss Choi, please, would you like to stay for dinner? I hope we
I'll do
haven't
a little sound clap. You can unmute or not mute. I think it's quite nice to see waving hands on Zoom anyway. It has the same joyous effect for me. It's the only thing we can get when we're not doing live events anyway. Thank you so much for reading beautifully, Graeme. I'm going to give you host now because Graeme is going to share us a slideshow about his times from Macau and tell us a little bit about what Macau is like for us that have not been. I've not been personally, so very much looking forward to Graeme's insiders.
So am I now host as well? Or
You should be, if it worked.
Right.
I think I've done it. Did you get an option to be host?
I think that's worked.
There you go. Yeah, perfect.
And my computer desktop is as untidy as my physical desktop. We'll get rid of that in a moment. Go into here, go into here. And there we are, I think. So I don't want to make this a geography lesson, and I don't want to make it like one of those occasions where you get totally bored by your friends' holiday photographs where they show you every single photograph from the moment they arrived at the airport or something like that. But nonetheless, I thought it might be worth just a couple of slides, just really showing where Macau was to start with. Most people will be familiar with Hong Kong, but we see Macau there, just at the other side of the Pearl River estuary, and really tiny in comparison with Hong Kong. And then when you get to Macau itself, it's traditionally formed of 3 parts. There's the historic center, which is the peninsula of Macau. And then there were always 2 islands, Taipa and Koloan. Koloan being always the more rustic and rural of the parts. But these days, as you can see, there's been a huge amount of reclamation, and Taipa and Koloan are now really merging into one. And although it doesn't feature in any of my stories, it's not something I'm particularly interested in. This area here is known as Cotai, which is the gambling heart, or one of the gambling hearts of Macau, where these days well, of course, with COVID, everything is kind of messed up, but under normal circumstances, it has a casinos have a turnover which is greater than those of Las Vegas these days. And Macau was established by the Portuguese in the mid-1500s. And this is a watercolor I found online. I should say that, the pictures I'm showing are a mixture of things I've borrowed from online sources, some of my own photographs. And also, anybody who really is interested in Macau, and if you're on Twitter, then there's a wonderful Twitter account called Old Macau Archives that just tweets photographs and maps and pictures from Macau over the centuries. And it's absolutely a fascinating resource that I've always found very useful. This is a watercolor, I believe, from around the 1840s, showing the main sort of waterfront in Macau. What the Eiffel Tower is to Paris, or the Colosseum to Rome, or the Leaning Tower is to Pisa, or maybe sort of Big Ben is to London or something. The ruins of the Church of St. Paul, which was built in the early 1600s and destroyed by fire in the 19th century, are the iconic image of Macau. And you can find some nice photographs that show this facade, which is basically all that remains, apart from the crypt and a few foundations. And there's some nice photographs over the decades and years that kind of show, it's kind of like a totem, and you can see the changes to Macau that have gone around it from these old images. I love that one. I really couldn't put a date on it, but I found that a fabulous image. Then you move forward, maybe, I think it's maybe somewhere in the 50s. And then you start to see, I think, again, it's probably 50s or maybe into the 60s, where the development of Macau starts to grow. And you've got there the inner harbour in the background, and the hills in the background are mainland China itself. And then you can go into the 70s and a bit more development still. And then you get to the present day, where I have to probably use my cursor here to actually show you where the ruins are, surrounded by the massive streets and alleyways that form the Macanese Peninsula these days. My writing about Macau, though, was very much prompted by this place, which is a picture of the old Protestant cemetery. When British, Dutch, and North American sailors started coming to China especially in the late 1700s and early 19th century. Macau was their base. This is before Hong Kong was established. But being a strongly Catholic city, there was a problem with burials of Protestant sailors and missionaries and their families. Eventually, a small plot of land was set aside in Macau for Protestant burials. And it's not large, but it's one of the most, it's a funny thing about cemeteries, whether they're Hampstead or Paris or wherever, they can be immensely evocative places. And the old Protestant cemetery in Macau has gravestones and some more ornate memorials for Royal Navy sailors, American sailors, some missionaries, some their family, including some very young children. It's all very sad in that regard. Again, dates from around 1750s into the early 19th century. And I always loved going to this place. And when I started thinking about writing about Macau, this is where I started. And I started in particular with this gravestone, the gravestone of George H. Duncan, who died in 1857. Chose him in particular because the graves have been recorded and studied, and nobody actually really knows who George H. Duncan was. There isn't a history to him, so it gave me free rein to write a story about him. And that was my first story set in Macau, and that was really what set off the whole sequence of events that have led to this glorious day today. The story I've just read is largely set in Coloane, and Coloane is a beautiful little place, a lovely little Portuguese church and square. I sort of imagined maybe that little cafe you can see at the bottom left might have been where Big Uncle was playing mahjong when he passed away, but This is a bit of fiction on my part. Oops, gone too far. Not the story I'm reading tonight, but one of the stories in the book, a story called And All Will Be Well, which was the story that won the Ilkley Literary Short Festival competition in 2018, is really set on fishing boats and fishing junks over a period of time from the sort of 1950s into the 1960s. So I was quite pleased when I found these photographs. I think these are taken from the Old Macau Archives Twitter feed, and I think this was dated around 1959-ish. And this may be a little bit later. You can probably, this building here suggests it's 1960s, but you wouldn't necessarily know that from the boats, many of which are still in a very traditional form with sails, some with sails, some without. And I kind of very much imagine that the boat that Ling Hua is sailing on falls foul of a Chinese patrol boat in Chinese waters was probably a boat something like one of those that had left the inner harbour of Macau. But I don't necessarily want to give the impression that Macau is full of beautiful old Portuguese churches and nice and characterful old buildings and pretty junks. A lot of it is also rather run down. This is actually a photograph I took of the Rua de Santo Antonio, which is a street famed for its antique shops, and it features in a couple of stories, including from somewhere the Centre of Jasmine that closes the collection, where the shop is in this street, and it's, as you can see, it's actually a rather drab and uninteresting street. As many, in all honesty, many of the actual streets within Peninsula Macau are, they're not necessarily all beautiful. But you can turn the corner sometimes and find an attractive little oasis, but otherwise a lot of it is very, inevitably it's a very densely populated city, small streets, small apartments crammed close together. The picture of the truck down here probably gives you the clue here that this is not one of my photographs, it's a little bit older. But I kind of, the buildings themselves are the type of things you could still see today. I've always thought this particular one struck me as the type of house that Lei Wai's family probably lived in when, in the first story in the book, A Short History of Chinese Tea, a family that's perhaps has been in better times and now somewhat on its uppers, and kind of the house rather would reflect that. And Lei Wai, of course, ends up owning a tea shop, which features in a couple of stories. This is quite a well-known tea shop, actually. I did write it down. It's the Lung Hua tea house. I think hers would probably have been a little bit smaller than that, but nonetheless, it would have been of something of a similar style. And then there's this image that Isabel found online for the book cover, and it's an excellent image. It's an old painting of the goddess Matsu, which perhaps we'll come to again back in the when we get to the Q&A section. It's a lovely image, and it was a great choice by Isabel for the book cover. And Matsu is the goddess of seafarers, and the Ma in Matsu is thought to be, etymologically speaking, the same as the Ma in Macau, the name itself. And the most famous temple in Macau is the Ama Temple. And again, courtesy of the Old Macau Archives Twitter feed, found a couple of wonderful 19th century etchings of this temple. And here again. It's not quite as romantic a sight these days. It's actually quite a, this is one of my own photographs. This is actually quite a hard place to photograph, because the temple is set into the hillside on various levels with a lot of rocks and trees, so you can't really stand back and get a good picture of it, but it's a very active, very prominent, and probably the most important temple in Macau. And then I'll just leave this with this lovely picture I found online of an overhead picture of modern Macau, the peninsula anyway. If you remember the very first, not the first picture, the old 1840s watercolor of the Prior, that would actually these days, that would have been this coastline here. And the Armagh Temple is somewhere about around there. And goodness knows where St. Paul's is. It's somewhere lost in the crowd here. But as you can see, these days, there's so much reclamation. When I first started going to Macau, this was non-existent at all. I'm not sure this area existed. But that's the nature of things these days. And here we've got the inner harbour and the river that separates the peninsula of Macau from mainland China over on this side. So I hope that, I say, without wanting to bore you with either geography or too many pictures, hopefully that gives you some kind of idea of the place that Macau is and some of the places that crop up in my stories. There we go. And we're back.
Thank you, Graeme. All went without a hitch. That's what you want on Zoom as well. Those photos were beautiful.
That's months of Zoom practice.
Every day, Graeme's been prepared for this launch. I think I'm particularly sold on Coleraine. I want to say Coleraine, but now I'm doubting myself. But yeah, I think there I would go if I was visiting. That looked beautiful. Well,
there's a couple of rather nice beaches, including one's it's a black sand beach, but it's a lovely beach, and so, quite a famous sort of, I assume it's still there, seafood restaurant, Fernando's, famous for its prawns and things. But
lovely. Graeme, if you have a voice left, would you be able to read us another story? You actually mentioned it when you were reading. Oh no, you didn't actually. I think you mentioned A Scent of Jasmine, didn't you? You're going to read River Crossing for us instead.
I'm going to read River Crossing. I think A Scent of Jasmine you need to read The Price of Medicine to really get.
Yeah, there's two stories that are linked in the book, and so we return to the same character at two different time zones and at different stages in her life. So yeah, those are really interesting, but instead we're going to read you one which stands alone called River Crossing.
This story is very much a Leeds Writers' Circle story, because it was actually originally written for one of the Circle's short story competitions. The judge was the poet and story writer Alison Locke, but she actually specifically wanted stories of up to 1,000 words, and they had to have a kind of connection with nature and the natural world. And well, I'll be honest, I was a little bit miffed when I was only highly commended. There you go. But Isabel encouraged me to expand this one. So what I'm about to read is an expanded version of the story that entered that competition. And I think the expanded version is significantly better. But it's not a long story. It's shorter than Palmerton, Colorado. The water is the color of the yun yun coffee that starts my day. Though when the algae blooms, the river resembles a carefully manicured lawn, as if one might simply walk across it, if only. Close to the city, barges and dredgers join together in a forest of floating cranes, while further out along the main channel, larger vessels head out to sea. And further out still, well, that's the other side. But it's also different now from how it once was, when two young lovers stepped gingerly into the water under a clouded, moonless night. They left their village in the quiet before dawn. The Red Guards had arrived 2 months earlier, and since then, each day had been marked by public denunciations. The schoolmaster had been first, forced to admit that he had been teaching George Eliot. The shopkeeper was accused of cheating his customers by leaning on the scales when he weighed out the rice. One farmer was blamed for the drought that had left half the fields barren, another for the flooding that had left the rest waterlogged. Theirs had been a secret love. Their families had been at odds for as long as anyone could remember, and for reasons no one could recall. But the arrival of the Red Guards made petty differences irrelevant. Of far more immediate concern to the boy and girl was the announcement that all young people in the village would be sent away to unlearn their crimes. The two lovers would be separated. They would be apart for the first time in their lives. I'm slow to get out of bed these mornings. The arthritis is getting worse. I don't sleep much, and when I lie awake in the night, I listen to my heart beating. It feels faint and uncertain, as if my body is unsure whether to continue, or whether perhaps it is time to rest for good. I am unconcerned by this, and I have accepted that soon the day will come when I don't wake. Until then, I think of her and see her as she was, young and pretty, with a slender face and eyes that looked upon the world as something to explore. Sometimes I think I see her in the street, and when I do, she hasn't aged, unlike me. When I look in the mirror, all I see are lines and liver spots. They had been travelling for days, losing track of how long they'd been on the move, first by bicycle and then on foot. Wherever possible, they took unmarked paths, avoiding villages and towns, avoiding people, avoiding detection. They scavenged for food or went hungry and slept in fields or abandoned buildings, holding each other close to keep away the dark. The girl pushed away the unwanted thoughts that came to her unbidden when they stopped moving. The memory of the time 9 weeks ago when she had become a young woman and he a young man. She wonders how she can tell him. I live alone with no one to look after me, no children to help me, no grandchildren for me to spoil. When I see my neighbours handing out the lycée packets at New Year, there is always a sense of what if? There'll be nobody to leave offerings after I've gone, when my heart finally decides that one more beat is just not worth the effort. I worry that nobody will know until the police have to break down the door and find a putrefying body, much like they did all those years ago. Eventually, they arrive at a place where they have to wade through streams and push their way through thickets of bamboo. Now they're standing in a mangrove swamp at the water's edge, watching the lights beckoning from across the water. It looks further than they expected, and the girl is nervous, fiddling with a necklace he gave her. She has never before swum further than the length of a small lake back home, barely more than a pond, where the village children would cool off from the summer heat. We'll never make it that far, she says. Of course we will, trust me. Anyway, we can't go back now. This is true. Even if they could make it back to the village, the punishment they would face would be worse than going forward. The boy takes her hand. She is shaking and he holds her tight. But we won't get across dressed like this. Our clothes will drag us down. They strip to their underwear. She turns away, although there is nothing to see yet. Still they delay, thinking of families left behind. Only the white-haired night herons breaking the silence. Finally, the boy speaks. Follow me. He puts one foot into the water. It is colder than he expected, and he can feel the mud and ooze between his toes. Slowly, he adjusts to the temperature, but he has to fight to resist the urge to turn back as he moves into the deeper waters, and the strong, embracing current takes hold of him. Instead, he goes towards the lights, drawing him forward to a different future. Come on, he says to the girl. It's easy, he lies. I come to this park when I can, aches and stiffness permitting. Today has been hot, and although the sun is starting to set, the air is still charged with the heat of the day. I find myself struggling a little for breath, so I take a rest on a concrete bench where I can look across the water, think back and remember. She joins me whenever I sit here and remember that night. Often she shares the bench with me. Sometimes children play at our feet and she smiles at them indulgently as they run and jump, laugh and shout. And those are bittersweet times where what might have been becomes hard to ignore. It's not easy. The water is cold, the current strong. He kicks out from the bank, but the river grass catches around his feet. He stops to rest, his feet just reaching the riverbed, but the water laps against his mouth, and he has to hold his lips tightly closed. He feels fish brushing against his legs, or at least so he thinks. He has a fear of the unknown, the unseen. He tries to put out of his mind the crabs, eels, and shrimp that live beneath the surface. The boy looks back to the girl and can see that she is struggling. He should go back and help, but the lights beckon him forward. To his surprise, it gets easier in the deeper water. He hears the girl behind him, but her strokes are erratic, desperate. She's floundering. He thinks she's saying something, but he can't make out what. Ahead, the lights are bright, and now he can hear the sounds of life on the approaching shore. He has to choose between going forward or back to help the girl. But he is tired himself, oh so tired. The cold has drained him of energy. His legs and arms are heavy and barely move in response to his commands. The lights call out to him, urging him onwards. I like to think I can see where we stepped out that night, but I know it's wishful thinking. There's been so much development since. 5 gold stars on red flutter in the wind where egrets and cormorants once flew, and office blocks in the Parliament building stand in place of bamboo. At night, the other side of the river is illuminated by Samsung, Coca-Cola and Nike. The shoreline itself has moved. I wonder if things would have been different had the river been as narrow then as it is now. Perhaps then we would all have made it across. He asks the police to look for her, but it is 3 days before a fisherman finds her in the muddy waters beneath the pontoon. He can't bring himself to look at the body, already decaying and bloated, but he knows it's her from the necklace she wears. There's no need for an autopsy. She is just one of many, so she takes the truth with her and he will never know. When an appropriate time has passed, her body is cremated and her ashes are placed in a public columbarium along with those of her unborn child. I sense her behind me, but don't turn around. You should have come back to help me, she says. I know. There's not been a day in the last 50 years that I haven't told myself that. I also know that if I had gone back, neither of us would have made it across. Not that knowing that makes me feel any better. But we're together now, she says, and this is as it is every time. We are silent until I recognize she has gone, and once again I'm just an old man sitting on a bench, remembering a night long ago. When I do finally turn around, I see that on this hot, sunny day, the ground behind the concrete bench is wet and covered with algae, leaves, and lily petals. The sun has started to slip behind the hills on the other side of the river, and from somewhere I hear once again the deep, raspy call of a night heron. Now I take some water.
Yeah, I think you need water at this point. It's always such a heartbreaking ending with that one. And I think it's really interesting that we have like a little hint about the regime at the start with the Red Guard spanning T.S. Eliot. So something to look into that. So what we thought we'd like to do at this point, after we've exhausted Graeme, is that we quiz him more so that he gets even more tired. But hopefully fun questions. It's always fun to talk about your own writing. So I'm going to hand over to Ben, and Ben's going to lead our Q&A. And like I said earlier, but some of you might have joined a bit later, if you've got a question that you want to ask, you can either put it in the chat or you can give Ben a little wave, and he'll either give the floor over to you. So, for example, Graeme, your question or whatever. But yes, so I'll hand over to Ben, and I very much am going to look forward to his questions.
Hi, Graeme. First, a massive thank you for that. It was, and for the slideshow particularly, it sort of informed a lot of the questions that I'd like to ask. I was wondering if you could tell us more about what it was that made Macau such a special place for you. I think we've seen some of your personality come out in the photos, but if you're able to explain a bit more about that'd be brilliant.
I guess a lot of these things started because, as most people, expats especially, but not exclusively, who live in Hong Kong, Macau is a popular place to visit for a weekend or break. It gets you away from the manic nature of Hong Kong into something that is actually, although it's still very crowded, it is a little bit more relaxed. It has that slightly Iberian sense of, there are motor scooters parked badly, and there are street signs with blue and white tiles, and the food is different, and it does give you that sense of being away and a sense of a holiday. But when you've made repeated visits, you start to appreciate its own particular qualities. And I think for me, without wanting to go into the pros and cons, the pluses and minuses, the goods and bads of empires, I find particularly interesting when you get these places like Macau I've never been to Goa, but I imagine Goa might be similar, or Malacca in Malaya, places that have echoes of times gone by in a very different world, and yet still somehow continuing into the present day. And especially Macau, where the Portuguese were there from the early sort of 1500s. It was such a long period of time that it will be quite a long period of time before those echoes have completely died away. And I find that sense of a time gone past, a time past that's still somehow hanging on, decaying and falling away, is something very evocative, and it appeals to me. Maybe that says something about me as much as anything.
Thank you very much, Graeme. That was very informative. As I said, to sort of repeat myself, I think it was really fascinating to see the pictures that you've compiled, and you know, from the various perspectives and parts of Macau. It's really given me a lot of insight after having read the book and written a review of it. To hear you speak the stories and see that, it really is brilliant. So thanks. I was wondering, perhaps in writing the book and spending so much time there, perhaps you know some works or authors that might not be very well known to many other writers, such as myself, from Macau or Hong Kong, perhaps.
This is difficult for me to answer when I can see that Sarah Dodd is here, who knows this subject far more than I do.
Apologise for putting you in that.
I'm in danger of embarrassing myself by answering that question too much. As far as Macau is concerned, in English, very, very little. Maybe that's one of the reasons I've chosen it as a subject to write about, because it's kind of, in the English language, it's kind of virgin territory. There'll certainly be some Portuguese writers, and the most famous Portuguese writer at all, my Portuguese accent will be terrible, but you know, Camões spent time in Macau and wrote some of his best work in Macau, and there's actually a park in Macau called the Camões Gardens, which is where he supposedly wrote one of his major works. But I was looking around to see what other fiction you could find about Macau in English, and the only thing I could come up with was there's an American screenwriter who writes some crime novels set in Asia and different towns, and he's written a book about Macau, but that's set very much in the modern day. It's a crime novel set amongst the casinos and the glitz and the glamour and so forth. As for Hong Kong, well, I say Sarah would know better than me, but she has introduced me to a couple of writers who are both very different from each other. If you're into surreal short stories, then there's Dorothy Che, who's very distinctive and say her stories are very surreal. But also there's kind of more mainstream, an excellent crime writer, Chan Ho Kei. Particularly his book The Borrowed, and Sarah might be able to update me on this. I think his second novel might be coming out shortly in English as well, which is, she's nodding, that's good. But I'd have to say, as far as Macau and Hong Kong are concerned, there's not an awful lot available in English. Though on the more literary side, you can also look at the website of Asian Cha, CHA, as an online literary journal for not exclusively Hong Kong, but it's based in Hong Kong, and that's also a good place to find more about writers from that part of the world.
Thank you very much, Graeme. I think congratulations on a very thorough answer there. It was wonderful to hear that. So thank you, and apologise for putting you in that spot, asking you about other writers. I haven't met Sarah myself, but hello, Sarah, and I am trying to keep my eye on people asking questions on to have a quick look at them. I'm not.
We got two for you, Ben.
So I'm going to go with a couple of questions that are in the chat, and it might be best if people can put it in there. I'm trying to keep an eye on the hands up, but struggling a bit. A really good question from where are we now? Oh, hang on, just scroll up. Stephanie asked Graeme, can and would you like to tell us more about what you did in Hong Kong and Macau, which I think is a great question.
Oh, it's a perfectly fine question. It's a very boring answer. I'm afraid I was a lawyer in Hong Kong, so it's not exactly terribly exciting, but so my Hong Kong years were from 93 to 2010. Macau was just as I said, it's a place to go for weekends and breaks, and just one of those places just fell in love with over time. But my actual personal activities in Hong Kong were very boring.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Graeme. I've got a question from Moira Garland, who knows Macau from the first half of the 60s when there was still a Portuguese garrison there. And she was wondering, from your time there, if you could tell us how much of Portuguese culture and influence is still visible in Macau, or was visible when the time during the time you spent there.
I'd say it's probably, there may be more influence visible than there in reality. There were, and indeed still are, 2 or 3 Portuguese language newspapers. There's the Portuguese street names and shop names, and you'll see the Portuguese language quite a lot. How much, and there's plenty of Portuguese restaurants still, and Macanese restaurants that kind of fuse that kind of Portuguese and Asian cultures, and also bring in foods from other parts of the Portuguese sort of world, Portuguese-speaking world, like Mozambique or Angola, bringing those in as well. So to create a particular cuisine. So those aspects of Portugal are still definitely there.
Wonderful.
Whether Portugal in a kind of deeper sense is still there, maybe more doubtful.
Thank you very much for that, Graeme. Question about the book itself, which I have my copy here. Is there a favourite story of yours that you wrote more than any other? And if so, what is it about that story that sticks out for you?
I think, well, it's difficult, they're all your own babies. I mean, how can you express a preference? But if I could only keep one of these stories and all the rest had to be cast to the 4 winds, it might be the first one, A Short History of Chinese Tea. There's something about that one that I really, I think it just, when I was writing it, it just came out so easily and smoothly, and the form of it came out so easily. I've just always been particularly attached to that one.
Brilliant, thanks, Graeme. Next question. I think you did actually touch on this in the slideshow presentation when we saw the gravestone of the person's name that slipped my mind. So apologise for that.
George Duncan.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah. And I was going to ask you, what was it that gave you the idea for this collection, and was it something sudden, or did it develop over time? You did mention it's something that was a bit of a germ that grew.
It was probably a germ that grew, and I wrote the story about George Duncan with no real intentions of going beyond that. But once I'd finished it, I thought, oh, this maybe is something I could do else with Macau. And I actually had an idea which I continued for a while, but then for various reasons I abandoned, that each story would have its starting point, a minor character in the previous story. So the very first story about George Duncan, within it, it's a story which is both set in Victorian times and the present day. And in the present day, there is a young Macanese doctor makes a brief entrance into the story. So then I decided that the second story I would write, neither of these appear in this book, would focus on her, this doctor. And then there would be a minor character in that second story, would be the major character in my third story, and a minor character in the third story become the major character in the fourth story, and so on. And that is how it began to multiply. And that is, to a degree, why in these books you'll see some characters reappearing. Though after a while, I found that structure and that formula for creating new stories actually not helpful. In the end, I found it a little bit too restrictive, largely because I ended up introducing characters into stories for no purpose other than to be the basis of the next story, and they didn't really properly belong in that first story. So I kind of, after a while, I abandoned that structure, but that's how it started.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Graeme. It definitely does add something to rereading the stories again. Linda Fulton, a really good question, would like to ask if, beyond the goddess story, did you intend to create such a strong feminist theme? The women appear strong and resolute even when used and abused in your stories. Did this theme grow out of the characters, or was it intentional from the outset on your part?
Linda told me earlier today that she's been working on a nasty question. So.
Well done, Linda.
It grew out of the stories. It wasn't intentional, but it was interesting. When Isabel and I were putting this collection together, we played around with a few titles. And it was Isabel who suggested The Goddess of Macau, because that does very specifically link in with one of the stories, and All Will Be Well. And there are a couple of other stories that allude to the goddess Matsu. But I also loved it as a title when Isabel proposed it, because I was conscious that although I hadn't set out to write the stories this way, that there are a lot, to my mind, of strong women characters in the book, in the stories. And I thought that in some sense, perhaps they are all, you know, reflections in some way of the Goddess of Macau. And yeah, so I didn't, to answer Linda's question, I didn't set out with that ambition, but I was conscious after I'd done a number of stories that perhaps had resulted in that. And why I particularly jumped on the title when Isabel proposed it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Graeme. My next question was actually about to ask if you could tell us more about your writing process, but the question from Sarah Dodd, who seems to be stealing the show a little bit this evening. So well done again, Sarah, because you've phrased the question a lot better than I had. So we'll go with your question. I think it supersedes mine. She's asking, at what point did you start to think of the stories as a cohesive collection? Did you go back and change much when you knew it was going to be published?
I think I probably, after I'd done 4 or 5, I thought, hang on, this is something that I can make actually a collection out of. Yes, some did get changed a little bit when it came to putting them into a collection. For example, in the first story I read, An Apartment at Coloane, in the first version of that story, the young woman is actually the same Meiwa who appears, anybody who has read these stories, in 2 other stories. But then when it's fine that when that was independent, but when I actually thought of putting them together, I realized that then there'd be some inconsistencies between the stories and it wouldn't work. I think that, sorry, I've lost the thread of what I was saying here now. Otherwise, some stories have been changed a little bit just in response to suggestions from Isabel from an editorial viewpoint. But maybe the main change is simply the selection of picking the stories, because, you know, what you're not aware of are all the stories that got left out and aren't in this collection for various reasons. They're simply not as good, mainly, or they're not ready or need more work doing to them.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Graeme. Some fantastic questions there. Apologise if I've missed any questions. I am scrolling up and down
you just got the one, Ben. No, you've only missed one. It's from B. Jane, and it's, do they sing Fado? And Graeme, you might have to explain what Fado is, because I've just Googled it. But
sorry, I didn't quite get the question. Fado?
Yes. Do they sing it?
In Macau, I've heard of it being sung in restaurants in Macau. I've never myself encountered it, but I have heard that it does occasionally appear, yes. Well, it certainly appears that occasionally a fado singer will actually come to Macau to put on a proper show. But I have also heard that occasionally you do get a little bit of fado in some Portuguese restaurants, but not huge amounts.
And by the way, if anyone didn't have the chance to Google it like me, it says it is an expressive and profoundly melancholic Portuguese singing.
It's lovely fado. I am a big fan of fado.
Brilliant. Well, I too had never heard of fado, so I've definitely learned something this evening. So thank you for that question, and thanks Isabel for spotting that one. Apologies, I missed it. I think it was a short one, so I was looking out for 2 or 3 lines in the questions. That's why I missed it. My next question is going to be an awkward author question. Rather than ask who is your favourite writer, which is a bit of a cheap shot, I just wondered if I ask that question, put it out there, what writers would first come to mind? You know, maybe a handful of writers that you find yourself returning to, perhaps more than others, or.
Well, actually, Isabel asked this question of me a few weeks ago for a blog post he was doing, and when I stopped to think about it, at first I didn't think there were anybody especially, but then I thought about it a little bit more, and I realised that 2 writers that probably would say first. One is David Mitchell, and the other is Haruki Murakami, and perhaps their influences. It sounds highly pretentious to say you've been influenced by writers of that standard, but the way David Mitchell might have his characters reappearing from story to story and from novel to novel is something I kind of like. So I've been happy to sort of pinch that idea. And I know in the case of Murakami, it's perhaps I always love the way the weird and the magical sort of come into the mundane and the everyday in his novels. So those are 2 writers who, when a new novel comes out, I'm going to turn to quite quickly.
Brilliant. Again, a very thorough question, very thorough answer there.
Oh, very thorough question as well, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, praising myself then best. I was also wondering, I read in the back of the short story collection that you're working on a novel, and I was wondering if we'd see any of the characters again, perhaps, or maybe a few sneak peeks from yourself, or I don't know.
There are about another 8 or 9 Macau short stories that are not in this collection. They're either early ones that I finished, and yeah, they're early ones. They're okay, but not brilliant. And others are still works in progress. But 2 of those stories do feature characters who are in the novel in progress. And equally, it kind of worked the other way. I also wrote a story a few months ago where I wanted to get to know one of the characters in my novel better. That sounds like a strange thing to do, but I had this character, I like this character, and I wanted to get to know her better. So I decided to write a short story about her, set a couple of years before the events of the novel. So there's a little bit of an interplay between the 2 that I suspect at the end of the day, there won't actually be any characters in the novel who exist in a published short story. But there's definitely some interplay between the 2.
Brilliant. Thanks, Graeme. A question from Moira Garland that's just come in, which I think ties in nicely. It's sort of an extension almost of my question. Is the novel set in Macau too? That the novel that you're working on at the moment?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Oh, sorry. Is the novel that you're working on at the moment, is that set in Macau also?
Yes, it is. It's set in Macau in 1949, 1950. It's the years immediately after the war, coincident with the ending of the Chinese Civil War and the establishment of the PRC. And it's based very much, without sort of giving spoilers away, one of the great things about Macau over the years is that it has always been very receptive to refugees. During the Second World War, a lot of refugees went to Macau from Hong Kong, or indeed from mainland China. Because being Portuguese, it was technically neutral territory, so it was kind of a neutral island, bolt hole, surrounded by Japanese-occupied territories. And then after the war, when the PRC was established, lots of refugees came from mainland China into Macau, and then later still, lots of refugees came from Vietnam into Macau, and Macau has always been incredibly receptive to refugees. I mean, the population of Macau sort of doubled or tripled during the war with refugees, and that's the background of the novel I'm writing about, Macau in those years.
Wonderful, thank you, Graeme. I think from sort of reading the stories and reviewing them, it definitely came across to me that you really catch the intersection of sort of European, Portuguese and Chinese culture. And with that in mind, it must be quite meaningful to yourself that The Jade Monkey Laughs is published in English, Portuguese and Chinese. And I thought you might like to talk to us a bit about that.
Well, I was thrilled with that. It was the Macau Literary Festival, which I entered, thanks to Sarah, who had recommended I do, because she found out about it. And as a consequence, winning that, apart from this sort of, just pleasure of having won the English language competition, a Portuguese competition and a Chinese competition, then all the winning stories are published along with writings from real writers, you might say, be they Portuguese or Chinese, all about Macau. And then the volume is published in the three languages, English, Portuguese and Chinese. So it is just kind of, I have to say, fun as a writer to see your work published in Portuguese and in Chinese as well. It's kind of a little bit weird, but rather nice.
Brilliant, thanks, Graeme. Are there ways that you can easily identify how Macau has changed since you lived there, and also when was the last time that you went? And if you can identify those reasons, can you perhaps offer any explanation as to why that might be? I know that's quite a lot to ask of you.
No, well, I never actually lived in Macau. I should say I always lived in Hong Kong, but used to go to Macau. Well, the main changes are the same changes that are happening into Hong Kong with the ending of the British rule in Hong Kong in '97 and Portuguese rule in Macau in '99. It's simply the greater integration of Macau into the Chinese sort of ecosystem, especially around the Pearl River, both at a cultural and economic and a business sense. The big, most dramatic change in Macau is the explosion of the gambling industry, which for a long time was a monopoly held by one particular company and one particular man, Stanley Ho. And then that monopoly was taken away, and all the big casino companies like Sands and Wynn all moved into Macau. And for better or worse, I'm a Yorkshireman, so I don't believe in gambling and throwing away money, but it's had a huge influence. I mean, on the plus side, it's brought a huge amount of money into Macau, for transport infrastructure or homes or hospitals or whatever. But it's also brought in, well, there's always a fair amount of organized crime and a shady side to Macau. That certainly hasn't gone away with modern times.
Brilliant, thanks, Graeme. I've just got another couple of questions. One of them I thought might be nice to sort of turn the tables. Is there anything that you would like to ask from me as a reader of the book about my experience of reading it?
Well, I've read, there've been 2 reviews of the book that I've read so far, and they've both said, amongst other things, they both said the same thing, and it's kind of really rather surprised me, though. I had to stop back and think, I suppose they're right, but I hadn't thought of it. They both commented that it's kind of, was the effect of it, it's kind of a dark read, not a cheerful read, and a lot of the stories have kind of a dark overtone, or not even always an overtone, sometimes quite dark in their own right. I was quite surprised by that. I'd never thought of the stories as being particularly sad ones or melancholic ones, but maybe they are, and I'd be curious to know how other readers found them.
Personally, I think, having sort of written the review, which I don't think it's gone to publication yet, I don't know if I don't think I found them particularly melancholy. I thought I really liked how you represented that the people had quite hard lives, and I think that actually gave a lot of the characters a nobility. But for me, I perhaps that says more about my personality and perhaps yours, I don't know. But I listen to Leonard Cohen and stuff, which people say is depressing. I don't find it depressing. So but it is fascinating that people will bring their own personalities into the regions of the stories. And the last question is there anything that you would like to add, Graeme, at all?
Oh, anything I'd like to add?
Is there anything, yeah, just to sort of round up the interview, is there anything that, you might have been dying to say and either myself or anyone else hasn't asked, the question that's prompted it?
Not that comes to mind especially. No. I think
well, in that case, I'll just before I hand it back over to Isabel, thank you very much for everything, Graeme. It's a delightful book to have read and reviewed, and I really enjoyed the slideshow. It gave me a lot of background, so a big thank you from myself and to all the questions, to everybody who asked the questions. Some wonderful questions there, definitely upstaged some of my ones, and big thank you, and I'll hand it back over to Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, thank you, everyone. We were worried that you might be shy this evening or not be inquisitive, which has happened to me before when you're going live and you're sitting there like 11. So thank you. You've asked Graeme some really interesting questions. And it's wonderful to celebrate the launch review when we can't in person. So I just want to say a really big congratulations to Graeme. It's a strange time to launch a book, but yeah, I love this collection. It's been a pleasure to work with you. And it's been a pleasure to host you all this evening, although Graeme is now the line. So I can't even end our meeting. Go back to our real host, Graeme Hall.
Oh, I'm the host, am I? Well,
Yeah.
Well, if there is anything else I should say, I don't wish to embarrass you, Isabel, but thank you very much for everything you have done in putting this together. And it's been a real eye-opener for me to know just how much work goes from saying, oh, I really like this person's stories, to actually getting a book out at the end of the day. I think those of us who have never had a book published before have no real idea what goes into it, what steps are taken, and how much is involved from selecting the stories, editing, laying them out, proofing them, designing a cover, getting the blurbs done, everything like that. Really have no idea until you actually go through this, and you've been incredibly helpful. Thank you, Isabel, in holding my hand, metaphorically speaking, through this process. So thank you. So thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Those people who I can see there, family members and so forth, I shall contact you by email afterwards. So since I'm the host now, Isabel, shall I just end the meeting at this point?
Yes, thank you, everyone. Have a lovely weekend. If you'd like Graeme's book, it's $7.99. It's available through the Wall Press, which is flowerondthewallpoetry.co.uk. Also on Amazon, but we prefer Waterstones. If you're going to boycott the shop, absolutely fine, but Waterstones, because Jeff Bezos doesn't need any more money. Waterstones does. So we'll go with that. But yeah, and it's also available in ebook if that is your thing instead. So thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you. I should end it all now.